Hello, listeners, and welcome to a special episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. No preamble from me. If you want to hear more about our wealth management services, our research and consulting and advisory services, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Also, a reminder, I'm going on vacation next week, so the cadence of the podcast is a little messed up, and that's one of the reasons I'm coming to you with this special solo podcast. But there's also some very important things happening in the world geopolitically, and I need to share some thoughts and analysis with you. Russia has been threatening almost since the very beginning when it signed the Black Sea Grain Initiative or agreed to it last July to leave the deal because it was not satisfied with it. They actually tried to leave the deal in November, and ships continued to make their way in and out of the Black Sea, and Russia got a lot of international pressure for its decision, and they came back into the deal. They shortened the amount of time that each subsequent approval had to go, but finally, after threatening for months, Russia is out of the deal. And I just want to look at the Foreign Ministry of Russia's statement because I think it's fairly telling. So on Monday, Russia announced that it was leaving the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It accused the West and Ukraine of basically lying about what the point or what the objectives of the Black Sea Grain Initiative were. Russia said that it was to get grain to developing countries that shouldn't be punished as a result of the Russian-Ukraine war. Russia calls out specifically that countries like Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Somalia accounted for less than 3% of the 32.8 million tons of cargo that's been exported from Ukraine since the grain deal was initiated. We will hack that number apart here in a second, but that is what the Russians want you to believe and what they are saying. They also actually call out some Western corporations by name, Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto, and talk about how Ukraine has been overrun by these Western corporations that are the real ones pulling the strings, and that Westerners are actually the ones that are profiting from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, not even Ukrainians necessarily themselves. From there, the Russian statement turns to a list of grievances tied to the notion that none of the things that were agreed to for Russia in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, like reconnecting Russia to the SWIFT system, like allowing exports of Russian fertilizer and spare parts and things like that. A resuscitation of an ammonia pipeline was also on their wish list. Russia says they got none of what they were promised from the West. And as a result of all of this, they've decided to terminate the agreement. Now, for me, the most interesting part of the statement was, and this is the last paragraph, I will read you the Google translated version of the Russian. If Western capitals really value the Black Sea Initiative, then let them seriously think about fulfilling their obligations and actually withdrawing Russian fertilizers and food from the sanctions. Only upon receipt of concrete results and not promises and assurances will Russia be ready to consider restoring the quote-unquote deal. In the immortal words of Don Draper, aha, now we are negotiating. That looked like a negotiating position to me originally because Russia's basically saying, look, we're open to the deal. We will join the deal, but here are our terms. And I thought that Russia would have major constraints in following through on some of the things that it has. Before we get to that, let's hack into that number, 32.8 million tons. I think that is mostly a half-truth. So if you look at European Council data, the Council of the European Union, they agree about 33 million tons of grain and other foodstuffs have been exported via the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Now, about half of that cargo is corn or maize, as the Europeans like to call it. Another 28% was wheat. Another 11% sunflower products. Ukraine, if most of you are not intimately aware or are not intimately familiar with the U.S. sunflower industry, although I am because I was recently talking to some sunflower farmers. If you're listening, nice to have you guys here. Europe is a major consumer of sunflower oil in general, and then another basket of 11% others. Now, here's the thing. When you look at corn, it's roughly equal. 51% of Ukrainian corn exports since last July went to developing countries, 49% to developed countries. And that actually tracks with historical data. In general, corn really equals developing and developed markets equally from Ukraine. Wheat, however, 64% of Ukraine's wheat went to developing countries and 36% went to developed countries. I think if you're Russia, if you throw all these numbers together, you can make it seem like developing countries were not getting what they needed from the grain deal, but that is just a patently half-false truth. Yes, overall, if you look at the overall numbers, there is balance between them, but the developing countries that rely on wheat because it is the cheapest, and who really can't afford to source from other places, those are the countries that are going to get hit the most by this. And again, Europe calls out Ethiopia, Yemen, Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, Djibouti. I think as we are talking here about wheat futures and investments and things like that, or as you are paying more for the baguette at your local bakery or whatever bread that you're paying for, flour that you're paying for, just recognize that even if wheat prices do ascend considerably, most of you listening to this podcast will be able to afford them. The places where people can't afford it are places that are going to be dependent on food aid. Think about this raging war in Sudan right now, or in parts of the world that are very stressed and really don't have alternatives. So I think there's a little bit of Russian spin that is going on there in general. I also looked at some data from the United Nations, from UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, one of my favorite abbreviations to pronounce. And again, you see that when you actually look at the breakdown here, developing countries, whether it's wheat, whether it's corn, things like that, they were the ones that gained the most from the Russia-Ukraine Black Sea Grain Initiative, and that there really was a difference here. Even though the grain deal had trickled to mostly a halt over the last month due to Russian threats, there was a notable increase in the amount of grains that was coming out of the Black Sea to some of these countries after the initiative was agreed to. A particularly pertinent statistic, though, that really blew my mind is that even with the improvement in those supplies, roughly the equivalent of the country of Tanzania, of demand in Tanzania, was still not getting the grain that it needed, even with the Black Sea Grain Initiative in general. So that's not Tanzania itself. I'm just saying you've got a Tanzania-sized hole that you have to plug in terms of demand for wheat, at least according to the UNCTAD data. Countries like Bangladesh, Yemen, Ethiopia, and Djibouti figure highly on their list. If you kind of zoom out in general, if we think more generally, Ukraine exports wheat exports by destination in 2021. So before we get the skewing of the war data, Asia was the destination for over 50%, 55.1% of Ukrainian wheat exports went to Asia in 2021. And the top wheat importers of Ukrainian wheat before the war were Egypt, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Turkey, Yemen, and the Philippines, and then Tunisia, Libya, and Ethiopia behind them. I think it is also worth calling out the top 5 importers of sunflower oil from Ukraine, because if Russia really is trying to shut down shipping from the Black Sea, we have to go back to some of the doomsday scenarios that we were imagining last year that ultimately didn't come to fruition. So the top importers of Ukrainian sunflower oil are India, China, the Netherlands, Spain, and Italy. The last little statistic I want to throw at you, I know it's a little overwhelming, but the last statistic I want to throw at you is that if you look at the volume of agricultural exports from Ukraine as a result of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, just from August 2022 to 2 days ago, July 17th, 2023, the country that got the most million metric tons of Ukrainian agricultural exports was China. China by far, followed by Spain, Turkey, Italy, the Netherlands, and then Egypt, Bangladesh, and some other developing countries behind it. I can't imagine that China is particularly happy about what's going on in the Black Sea right now, unless they have assurances from Russia that they're going to get the grains that they need somewhere else. And that to me is one of the wild cards in all this. Has Russia been doing shuttle diplomacy since they first tried to pull out of the deal since last November? Are they guaranteeing countries like China, like Bangladesh, like Egypt, hey, Russia's going to export you this grain. We are going to shut down the Black Sea, but don't worry, we are stepping in. Please don't criticize us the way that you did before on the world stage, so that we don't feel pressured into having to rejoin the deal when we don't really want to. I think it is also important to think about where we are in the war in general right now. So on Monday, we also got news that there was an attack on the Kerch Bridge, and this is the bridge that connects Russian forces to the Crimean Peninsula. And Ukraine was kind of tight-lipped about the situation, but Russia blamed Ukraine for the attack. And over the last 2 days, I'm recording this on Wednesday, July 19th. This will come out first thing tomorrow morning. Over the last 2 days, Russia has been attacking Ukrainian grain export infrastructure in places like Odessa and Mykolaiv, which are the main Ukrainian grain export hubs in the country. I've been impressed by the precision of Russia's attacks. If you go on the Ukraine Defense Ministry's website and you look at some of the pictures that they've released of the damage that was done to some of this export infrastructure, especially at the port in Odessa, it looks pretty direct and pretty precise. Ukraine claims that none of the Russian missiles were able to land and that they were able to shoot down a lot of the drones and that the damage is because of debris falling from those missiles. But looking at those pictures, I'm not a military expert here, but that doesn't look to me like debris. It looks like Russia was very seriously and precisely targeting some of these areas. And that tells us that Russia has not exhausted its supply of precision-guided munitions. Apparently, it has saved some, and it is making the point, and it is trying to knock out at least some of this Ukrainian export infrastructure in general. I think the next thing to say is I was very surprised by what the Russian Ministry of Defense has said today. So I'll read from you from the Russian Ministry of Defense. In connection with the cessation of the functioning on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, all vessels sailing in the waters of the Black Sea to Ukrainian ports will be regarded as potential carriers of military cargo. Accordingly, the countries of such vessels will be considered to be involved in the Ukrainian conflict on the side of the Kiev regime. Corresponding information warnings on the withdrawal of safety guarantees to mariners have been issued in accordance, blah, blah, blah. That's a showstopper for me. That's the Russian Ministry of Defense saying, okay, we are going to shoot at ships that are going to Ukrainian ports. And any country that is supporting those ships in general is going to be subject to Russian attack because Russia is going to consider that it is on Ukraine's side in the war. My first instinct here is I wonder if a country is going to call Russia's bluff there. Because remember, back in November, Russia had some very strident language. Ships came and went. Nobody really listened to the Russian warning, but Russia's really bearing its fangs much more so here. And it's very easy for me to sit here in New Orleans and say, somebody should call Russia's bluff. Somebody should see if they actually have the appetite for that kind of conflict. A much different thing if you're a mariner, if you're somebody who is on one of those ships, if you're a company that is trying to get insurance for those ships. I don't think that Ukraine's $500 million insurance fund to compensate companies that are exposed to these kinds of attacks is going to quite cut it. That's a major thing here. And for me, the key actor right now is really not Russia and it's really not Ukraine. It's Turkey. Turkey is the country that was the interlocutor between Ukraine and Russia in this Black Sea Grain Initiative. President Erdogan, who is basically begging for money in the Gulf right now and is coming away with tens of, if not hundreds of billions of dollars for his efforts. President Erdogan said earlier this week that his friend Vladimir really wanted the grain deal to continue, that Turkish officials were in contact with Russian officials, that they would talk. That Erdogan and Putin, I should say, would talk in August at a summit between them, and that Turkey was very optimistic that grain supplies could continue uninterrupted out of the Black Sea. It has not been uninterrupted. If you look at the ship cargoes and things like that, they had already trickled to a halt, but now they are basically at a zero. But the real question for me here is, what is Turkey going to do? Remember, just last week, we were talking about Turkey's superficial about face on NATO, but whether you think it was superficial or genuine, Turkey still withdrew its opposition to Sweden joining NATO. And Russia was not happy with that. And Russia said relatively pragmatic things about Turkey, but I'm sure that Russia was also not happy that Turkey decided to do that. And I was wondering at the time, it was kind of strange that Russia was being so polite towards Turkey. Maybe Russia knew that the other shoe was going to drop here, and maybe Russia looks at Turkey and says, okay, Turkey is turning to the West now. We cannot rely on this pragmatic actor, and all of this Turkish optimism about a grain deal is misplaced. What is Turkey going to do in response to Russia claiming that all of these ships going to Ukrainian ports are military cargo? Is that going to affect Turkey's interpretation of the Montreux Convention, which says that Turkey should theoretically block the Bosporus to military ships during a time of conflict? There's a lot of gray area there about whether Turkey's involved in the conflict. And also when it comes to international treaties and things like this, I don't put much stock in them. Countries will do what they want to do. But it really does raise a host of questions, and it cuts right to Erdogan and Turkey's legitimacy, because they have really emphasized the role that they've played in negotiating the Black Sea Grain Initiative, being a country that can have relations with both Ukraine and Russia. Russia has basically now taken a hatchet to Turkey's best laid plans, and I wonder what Turkey will do if Russia follows through on some of these threats. Does Turkey know something about what Russia's decision making is doing here, or are we really setting the board for potential problems between Moscow and Ankara, which would be the biggest development in the war thus far, and the thing I've honestly been wondering about and looking for since the war started. What happens next? Where do we go from here? Again, I'm recording Wednesday, July 19th. It is 1:43 p.m. New Orleans time. This will publish first thing in the morning. It is possible some things happen overnight. I don't think anything will change that much. But I will say, first and foremost, I think we're in for higher grain prices, and particularly wheat prices. I mentioned before we are long wheat at Cognitive Investments. We've been long wheat not necessarily because of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We think that there is more incremental demand out there in the market than, say, the USDA and some other sources are seeing. We see that China's buying more grains. We see a civil war in Sudan. We see Ethiopia, which is trying to recover from a civil war. We see bad weather conditions in lots of places and the potential for worse weather conditions, especially in China. Daryl Richardson is coming on the podcast. We're posting that next week to talk about weather and El Nino and how that's going to affect all of that. That was our picture for higher wheat prices. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative collapse was more of okay, you could get a steroid shot in the arm. It looks like we're getting that steroid shot in the arm, at least. But I think in general, you can expect more volatility and higher grain prices here, at least over the short term. And I would bet towards the end of the year. I don't know what's going to happen next. And anybody who tells you they know what's going to happen next, you should not be listening to them. And if you know somebody who is citing some other geopolitical analyst who is behaving like they have a crystal ball, please come introduce them to this podcast. Please let them come hear what real geopolitical analysis actually looks like. I have 4 rough scenarios for what I think could happen next. I'll describe them to you very briefly. The first is that Russia does exactly what it did last November. It rejoins the grain deal as previously constituted, or it signs a new deal imminently. This could happen several different ways. It could be that the global south puts a lot of pressure on Russia for doing this. You could imagine that maybe Russia does fire at a ship, and that is the thing that causes a lot of countries to get angry at Russia. I noticed that Putin is not attending the upcoming BRICS summit. South Africa says that's because it's awkward if he's there, because the ICC is based there and they might have to arrest him for war crimes. They don't want to do that. I wonder if that's because the rest of the BRICS are not so happy with Russia. Again, China's imported more Ukrainian grain than any other country since the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So, I've been droning on about how Russia and China, they may appear to be friends. They're not really friends. They are pragmatic when they need to be. I would imagine that China's not particularly happy about the developments here. But so option number 1, somehow, some way, Russia does get back into the deal or agrees to a new deal here in the next couple of weeks. The second one is that Russia knocks out Ukraine's basically transport infrastructure and logistics infrastructure internally. If Russia can knock out the ports at Odessa and Mykolaiv, if they can knock out the roads that lead to cities like Reni and Ismail, if they can basically grind Ukrainian export operations to a halt, well, then you don't have to bomb anything in the Black Sea. You just have to knock out all that Ukrainian transport infrastructure. I was talking to a group of friends and farmers and traders earlier this week, and I poo-pooed the notion that Russia was capable of all that. I'm a little more chastened after the initial attacks on Odessa and Mykolaiv. Those were a little more intense than I thought that they could be, and maybe Russia has a little more capability than I gave it credit for. Within this scenario is also the possibility of Russia firing on ships in the Black Sea. The upshot there would be no Ukrainian exports whatsoever. A third scenario I think we have to consider is that Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful. Amidst all of this, remember, Russia had some kind of weird mutiny, rebellion, attempted coup a couple of weeks ago. There are reports that Prigozhin was out there giving comments today that Wagner fighters are not going to be in Ukraine anymore. They're going to be going to Russia. The point being, Prigozhin's still alive. Maybe the emperor has no clothes. Maybe Putin is not in control. Maybe my scenario of Russian morale from soldiers and Russian defenses breaking down is going to be realized. Probably not. We've seen some reports of Russia actually amassing troops for an offensive of their own on the front line. So far, Ukraine's progress has been relatively slow, and we've talked about, you can go back and listen to the podcast with Simtak if you want to know exactly why. Still, if Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful, and for me, successful means cuts Russia's land bridge to Crimea, removes Crimea from Russian control and allows Ukraine to control Crimea. If you get any scenario that leads to that, well, then Russia can say all that it wants. I think Ukraine will be in a much stronger position. And then I think the last scenario is that just everybody ignores Russia, that they call their bluff, that Russia is not able to destroy enough of Ukraine's transport infrastructure to prevent grain from getting out, and that just nobody listens to Russia, and that Russia is caught just kind of sitting there saying one thing and making it as difficult and as hard as it can to get grain out, but ultimately grain will get out, And we'll be talking about how this was just a big nothing burger, just like last year. A lot of the biggest doom and gloom concerns about this were also a big nothing burger. What do I think the most likely scenario is? I still think it's number one. I still don't see how Russia can stick to this position for very long. I think politically, Russia is very constrained. Remember, Russia does not have good relations with Europe right now, and every single thing it does, Russia continues to think that it's going to put pressure on Ukraine by doing these things. It's not. It's just hardening European resolve against Russia. Just look at the way the European Union is ponying up billions of more euros to arm the Ukrainians indefinitely. You've got Germany saying they will do whatever it takes to keep Ukraine fighting against Russia in general. I don't think that Europe is going to turn around here. Obviously, Russia and the United States don't have good relations, and I think that Russia-China relationship is very, very complicated, even if they do have some things in common right this second. The upshot there is Russia needs the global South. Russia needs developing nations. It needs allies in global international institutions. It needs markets to send its commodities to. It needs all of these things for political legitimacy. And if you start messing around with the food security of these countries whose political support and political pragmatism you want, that's not going to last very long. So that's the political constraint there. I'm also just not sure that Russia is capable of what it's talking about. Russia can't even do what it wanted to do in Ukraine. It's really going to open up the window to a potential conflict in the Black Sea with NATO powers and things like that. That seems to me to be a bridge too far. And then the other thing here is Turkey's optimism is really striking. Erdogan continues to say, nope, like we're talking to the Russians. I'm talking to my friend Vladimir. He wants the grain deal. Turkey is confident that they're going to get the wheels going again and that there will be some kind of Black Sea grain initiative going forward. So those are three things that I'm watching for, or constraints that I'm paying attention to, that make me think that first scenario is the one that is most likely. But when I say most likely, I'm talking maybe 50% probability, 55% if I really had to push it. The other ones are sort of 10, 15, maybe 20%, depending on how we're going. And for each one of those scenarios, I've got signposts. I've got things that tell me that scenario is coming to fruition. I've also got things to look at what would invalidate these different theses. So we're watching for things that would invalidate the thesis that there is going to be some kind of return to the grain deal. And I will say that Ministry of Defense statement today, that qualifies. I mean, it could be Russia just making a threat, but I decided that it was time for an emergency podcast when I read what the Russian Ministry of Defense had to say, because they are at least trying to do this for real, unlike they did in November and unlike they did in previous months where they talked about the grain deal and how they didn't like it. So that is what is at stake here. It's my best effort at laying out what the situation is going forward. I think ultimately, even if there is some kind of return to the grain deal, like I said, I think more volatility and higher grain prices in general, especially wheat prices, is something that we're looking at. And we are, again, long wheat at Cognitive Investments, not investment advice, but that is our position right now. Our money is where our mouth is on that, and we'll see if it turns out to be true. And I do think, though, that eventually Russia is going to have to be dragged back to the table here. Key country to watch is Turkey, and we'll be watching very closely and giving you updates there. You can follow us at Cognitive Investments. We'll be updating in this week's Global Situation Report, obviously, and those who are subscribers to the Knowledge platform have access to my real-time insights as I look at these different scenarios and the different data points and see what direction things are going. So I hope that was helpful. Email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions or want access to any of those things that I just talked about. The human in me hopes that this is resolved at some point soon, because if the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, it just means pain and suffering for parts of the world that are already dealing with starvation and terrible things, and it's just depressing. Even for somebody who does geopolitics for a living, watching the interests of these developing nations, the global South, the ones that are most food insecure, being used as the pawns in this war. I have no other word for it but depressing. But that's the world, and that's why I tell a lot of dad jokes. Cheers, and see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.